The night my stepfather screamed that I was worthless trash, while my own mother stood there smiling and told me I should have learned to respect the man who stole my dead father's house. Roland's coffee mug hit the counter hard enough to crack the tile behind it. "Say it again," he said. "Say good morning to me like you mean it." I had said good morning. I said it every single day, on schedule, the way he demanded, because a flat greeting from a 16-year-old apparently qualified as disrespect in his house. Except it wasn't his house. It had never been his house. I just didn't have the paperwork yet to prove it. "Good morning, Roland," I said again, quieter this time. "That's it?" He stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. "You look at me like I'm nothing, like I'm some stranger who wandered in off the street." You are basically a stranger," I said, and I knew the second it left my mouth that it was a mistake, but it was also true. And at 16, I still believed true things were worth saying out loud. He crossed the kitchen in 4 steps. His face was inches from mine, close enough that I could smell the coffee and something sour underneath it. "You're pathetic," he said, and spit landed on my cheek when he said the P. "No wonder you don't have friends. No wonder nobody wants you around. You'll never be anything without me telling you how to act." I didn't wipe my cheek. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of watching me flinch. My mother stood by the sink with a dish towel in her hands, and she did not move. She rubbed his shoulder like he'd just said something wise and necessary. The way you'd calm a man who'd just caught a burglar in the yard. "You provoke him," she told me, and her voice was flat and cold, a voice I didn't recognize as belonging to the woman who used to sing to me in the car. "Young lady, if you acted like a proper daughter instead of an ungrateful brat, none of this would happen." A proper daughter? For what? For flinching at a man screaming over spilled coffee? For refusing to pretend my real father had never existed? "Dad built this house," I said. My voice cracked in the middle of it, which I hated. "He poured the foundation himself. You didn't build anything, Roland. You just moved into it." The kitchen went silent in a way that felt worse than the yelling. Roland's jaw worked side to side. My mother set the dish towel down very carefully like she was diffusing something. "Go to your room," she said. That night, after Roland had gone quiet in front of the television and the house had settled into the kind of stillness that always came after one of his outbursts, my mother came upstairs and stood in my doorway with an empty suitcase in her hand. "We think it's best if you move to the basement," she said, like she was reading off a memo. "Give everyone some space. Choose the basement or choose somewhere else to stay. Those are your options tonight." I looked at the suitcase. It was the same one we'd taken to Gulf Shores when I was 9, back when my father was still alive and none of this had a shape yet. "That's not a choice," I said. "That's a threat. Call it whatever helps you sleep," she said, and set the suitcase on my bed and walked out. I sat on the edge of my mattress for a long time after that, staring at the empty suitcase, thinking about the fact that I was about to spend a January in Ohio sleeping on a slab of unheated concrete because I'd said good morning in the wrong tone of voice. Then I picked up my phone and called the only person left who I knew would answer. My Aunt Dana picked up on the second ring. I need to back up because none of that makes sense without understanding who Roland Ashford actually was and how a 16-year-old girl ended up choosing between a basement and the street in the house her own father built. My name is Sadie Calloway. I was born in Cedar Hollow, Ohio, a town of about 9,000 people 40 minutes outside Columbus, in a hospital that has since been converted into a rehab facility. My father, Marcus Calloway, was a master electrician who ran his own 2-man outfit out of a garage on Route 9. He built our house at 14 Birchwood Lane with his own hands over the course of 2 years, starting when I was 4, finishing the year I turned 6. I remember standing in the framed-out shell of what would become my bedroom, watching him snap chalk lines across plywood, and him telling me that someday this exact spot was going to have my bed in it. It did. For 12 years, it did. He paid off the mortgage in full by the time I was 10. No bank owned any part of that house. He was proud of that in a quiet way, the way men like him were proud of things, not bragging about it, just mentioning it once at Thanksgiving and never again. He was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in February 2019. He died that June, 4 months later, at 41 years old. I was 11. My mother, Diane, fell apart in a way I understand better now than I did then. Grief does strange things to people, and I don't fault her for the first year of it, the year she barely left her room and I learned to make my own school lunches and sign my own permission slips. What I fault her for came later. She met Roland Ashford at a grief support group in Westerville in the fall of 2021, 2 years after my father died. Roland told the group he was a disabled combat veteran, medically discharged after an IED incident he described in enough detail that nobody in that room ever thought to question it. He told my mother he understood loss. He told her he understood what it was like to lose the life you thought you were going to have. She believed him completely, and honestly so did I for a while. He moved into our house, my father's house, in September 2021, 5 months before he and my mother got married at the Cedar County Courthouse, in a ceremony I was not asked to attend, only informed about afterward, over dinner, like a scheduling update. The early months weren't terrible. That's the part people don't want to hear when you tell a story like this. He was charming at first. He fixed the garbage disposal. He took my mother to dinner in Columbus and came home with flowers for both of us, which felt strange but not sinister. I wanted to like him. I wanted, more than almost anything at 13 years old, for my mother to be happy again, and if Roland was what made her happy, I was willing to try. The first crack came in April 2022, about 7 months after he moved in. I was doing homework at the kitchen table and knocked over a glass of orange juice. It wasn't dramatic. It splashed maybe 2 feet across the table and dripped onto the floor. I grabbed a towel immediately. Roland came in from the garage and looked at the puddle like I'd set the house on fire. "Do you have any idea," he said, "how disrespectful it is to make a mess in someone else's home and not even apologize?" I hadn't had time to apologize. I was still cleaning it up. But I said sorry anyway because I'd already learned, 7 months in, that arguing the facts with Roland only made things worse. My mother, sitting right there at the table, said nothing. She watched him say it. She watched me apologize apologize for something I hadn't finished doing yet, and she went back to her book like nothing had happened at all. I didn't understand it then, but that was the blueprint. That orange juice afternoon was every fight we would ever have, compressed into 2 minutes. He would manufacture an offense. I would apologize preemptively to avoid escalation. My mother would watch and say nothing, and her silence would function exactly like agreement, because in that house, silence was agreement. Over the next year, the pattern hardened into something with rules I could recite. Roland controlled the thermostat, the grocery budget, which channels we watched, and increasingly, who I was allowed to spend time with. He didn't like my best friend Marisol, said she was a bad influence after Marisol's mother once asked, gently, at a school pickup, whether everything was okay at home. He didn't like me spending time with Aunt Dana, my father's younger sister, who lived 40 minutes away in Westerville, and had never once pretended to like Roland. She's trying to poison you against this family, he told me once, after I came home from a weekend at Dana's house. Real family doesn't undermine real family. The irony of Roland Ashford lecturing anyone about the definition of real family would only become clear to me much later. There was a specific incident in August 2023 that I didn't understand the weight of until much later, but that I still think about, because it was the first time I watched Roland use my mother's grief as a tool instead of just living alongside it. It was my father's birthday. I'd started a small tradition after he died, just for myself. I'd drive out to the cemetery on County Road 4, leave a coffee from the gas station he used to stop at every morning on his way to job sites, and sit for a while. I was 15 that year, old enough to drive with my permit as long as an adult sat beside me, and I'd asked my mother to come. Roland said no on her behalf before she could answer. Today's supposed to be a normal day, he told me, standing in the kitchen doorway. We don't need to keep dragging this house backward into the past. Your mother's finally moving forward. Don't undo that. My mother stood behind him, and I watched her open her mouth like she wanted to say something, and then close it again. She didn't come with me. I drove myself, illegally, without a licensed adult in the passenger seat, because I was 15 and furious, and it felt like the only thing I had any control over that day. I sat at my father's grave alone for 40 minutes and told him about my cross-country season, the way I used to when I was younger, and it didn't feel strange yet to talk to a headstone. When I got home, Roland didn't yell. He just took my car keys, the spare set to my mother's old sedan, which I'd been using to drive myself to practice, and said I'd lost driving privileges for a month for putting myself in danger. My mother agreed with him. She used those exact words to the assistant coach who asked why I needed a ride to practice for the next 4 weeks, putting herself in danger. Nobody in that conversation ever mentioned that the danger in question was visiting my dead father's grave on his birthday, because Roland had made it about the driving, and once he made it about the driving, that was the only version of the story anyone outside the house ever heard. That was the pattern in miniature. He never attacked the thing that actually mattered. He attacked some adjacent defensible detail, and my mother backed the defensible detail every time, which meant the thing that actually mattered, that a 15-year-old girl wasn't allowed to grieve her own father in her own house without being punished for it, simply disappeared from the record. I got good, over those years, at noticing when a fight wasn't really about what it claimed to be about. I just never had proof of it. Proof, it turned out, was the entire problem. Feelings didn't hold up against a man who could always produce a reasonable-sounding excuse. My mother's silence had its own architecture too, and it's worth describing honestly because she wasn't simply passive. She actively participated in my isolation in smaller ways that were easy to miss if you weren't the one living inside them. She stopped inviting me into conversations with her side of the family unless Roland was in the room to steer them. She started reading my texts over my shoulder to make sure Marisol wasn't being a bad influence, a habit Roland had introduced and she'd adopted without apparent resistance. She once told my track coach, Mr. Petrosky, that I was going through a rebellious phase when he asked why I seemed withdrawn that fall, a phrase I only learned about because Mr. Petrosky mentioned it to me directly, gently the following spring, after everything had already come out. He said he wished he'd pushed harder that day instead of accepting her answer. I don't say any of this to paint my mother as some cartoon villain standing beside Roland. She wasn't. She was, I think, a genuinely broken person who had found in Roland a kind of certainty she hadn't had since my father died. Someone who made every decision for her, who never left room for ambiguity, who filled the silence in that house with his voice instead of her own grief. It was easier, I think, to let him be right about everything than to sit with how unmoored she'd been for those first 2 years alone. That doesn't excuse what she let happen to me. It just explains, as much as anything can, why she kept choosing him, morning after morning, over her own daughter. My mother changed too, slowly enough that I couldn't point to a single day and say, that's when I lost her. She stopped asking how my day was. She stopped coming to my cross-country meets, something she'd never missed even during the worst of her grief. She started repeating Roland's phrases back to me in her own voice, like she'd absorbed his vocabulary the way you absorb an accent from living somewhere long enough. Ungrateful, disrespectful, dramatic. By January 2025, 3.5 years after Roland moved in, I had stopped expecting anything different. I did my homework, I ran track, I kept my head down, and I counted the months until I turned 18. I had 18 months left. I thought I could survive 18 more months of tiptoeing around a man's moods in my dead father's kitchen. I didn't know yet that Roland had already quietly added his own name to the deed of that house. My mother had signed the paperwork in October 2023, 14 months earlier, transferring the property from her sole ownership into joint ownership with Roland, without ever mentioning it to me. I didn't know that my college fund, an $85,000 life insurance policy my father had taken out specifically for my education, naming me directly as beneficiary, structured so it would become accessible when I turned 18, had been quietly restructured that same year. I didn't know any of it yet. I just knew that a man with no blood connection to me had somehow become the person deciding whether I slept upstairs or in a basement with no window, and that my mother stood beside him and called it discipline. That's where the coffee coffee mug and the empty suitcase come in. That's the morning everything I didn't know yet started clawing its way to the surface. Aunt Dana didn't ask questions on the phone. She just said, "Pack a bag, I'm coming," and hung up before I could argue. She lived 40 minutes away, and she made it in 28. I was standing at the front door with my school backpack, the only thing I'd grabbed, when her headlights swung into the driveway. My mother got there first. She physically stood in the doorway, arms crossed, chin lifted, blocking the frame like a bouncer. "This is my house," my mother said to Dana, loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "You don't get to come here and take my daughter. She's not your property, Diane," Dana said. "She's a person, and she called me because she's scared. I'm not leaving without her." My mother's smile, because she was smiling, that particular tight, performative smile she wore for anyone she needed to convince, cracked for exactly 1 second. I saw it. A flicker of something underneath, gone as fast as it appeared. "Fine," she said. "Take her. See how far being ungrateful gets her." Dana didn't argue with that. She just reached past my mother, took my hand, and walked me to the car. Roland stood at the living room window the whole time, watching, arms folded, saying nothing, which was somehow worse than if he'd come outside and yelled. Once we were in the car, Dana called the police non-emergency line, calm and matter-of-fact, and reported that a minor had been placed in an unheated basement as punishment, and that she was taking temporary custody with the parents' verbal consent. An officer met us at a gas station a mile down the road, took a statement, and told my mother over the phone that she was legally allowed a supervised lunch visit the following day if she wanted one. My mother said yes immediately, in a bright voice like she was agreeing to a spa appointment. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. The lunch happened at a diner off Route 9 called Maple Street Grill, the kind of place with laminated menus and a pie case by the register. My mother arrived alone. Roland apparently had somewhere else to be, which at the time I read as a small mercy and would later understand as something closer to a pattern. Dana came with me, and about 10 minutes into the meal, once the waitress had cleared our plates, Dana pulled a manila folder out of her bag and set it on the table between us. "I want to show you something," she said to my mother, "since you're here." Inside were bank statements, a copy of the deed to 14 Birchwood Lane, showing Roland's name added as joint owner, dated October 2023, and a letter from a life insurance company, addressed to my mother as custodian, showing that the $85,000 policy my father had left for my education had been restructured into a different account 18 months earlier, an account my mother had access to, and one I did not. "Where is it?" Dana asked, tapping the letter. "Where is Sadie's money?" My mother's face didn't change much. That was the part that scared me. "It's been used for household expenses," she said. "Roland's job situation has been unstable. We needed it. Marcus left that money for one purpose," Dana said. "One, her education, not your husband's job situation." "Don't lecture me about my own husband," my mother snapped, and for the first time that day her voice actually rose. "You don't get to sit there and judge decisions you know nothing about." I sat between them, watching my father's sister and my mother argue over money that belonged to me, and I understood, with a clarity that felt like being dunked in cold water, that the $85,000 my dying father had set aside so I could go to college without debt was simply gone, not stolen in some dramatic, cinematic way, just quietly absorbed into a life I hadn't agreed to. I cried into my fries while strangers ate lunch around us, completely unaware that my entire childhood had just cracked open at a diner booth on a Tuesday afternoon. That night, back at Dana's house, I thought the worst of it was over. I was wrong. Roland texted me directly for the first time in months. "Your mother is devastated. You brought outside people into a private family matter. This is not going to be forgotten." I didn't respond. Dana told me not to. She said, "Save it, don't delete it, don't reply, just save it." And I did, though at the time I didn't fully understand why that instinct mattered as much as it eventually would. 3 days later, my mother called and asked me to come home, just to talk, just to work things out as a family. Against Dana's better judgment, but with her support, I went, because some small, stupid part of me still wanted this to be fixable. Roland wasn't yelling this time. That was almost more frightening. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with his hands folded, calm, controlled, like a man conducting a performance review. "You made a mistake bringing outsiders into this family," he said. "You understand that, right? Family handles family business inside the family." My mother stood behind him, nodding slowly, like a marionette whose strings someone else was pulling. "I want my laptop back," I said, because Dana had told me they'd confiscated it the night I left, along with my phone charger, in what I now understand was a deliberate attempt to isolate me from anyone outside the house. "You lost the privilege of being trusted," Roland said, "when you called the police on this family." I hadn't called the police. Dana had, but correcting him never mattered in that house. The facts were never really the point. I went back to Dana's that night and didn't return again except for the supervised visits a family court eventually mandated. But I didn't go back to school pretending everything was fine either. The next morning, I told my English teacher, Mrs. Hensley, everything. I hadn't planned to. I'd meant to just ask for an extension on an essay, and instead I sat down across from her desk and the whole thing came out at once. The basement, the suitcase, the missing money, Roland's texts. Mrs. Hensley did not blink once. She listened to the entire thing without interrupting, and when I finished, she said, "You did the right thing telling me." And then she walked me straight to the school counselor's office and stayed the whole time, through 2 hours of questions from a counselor and later a caseworker from Cedar County Children's Services. She missed her own planning period and part of her lunch to do it, and she never once made me feel like I was an inconvenience for existing. It was during that meeting, while a caseworker was cross-referencing details, that something surfaced almost by accident. Roland had listed himself on a prior custody-adjacent form, one filed years earlier during his previous divorce, before he ever met my mother, as a medically discharged combat veteran. The caseworker flagged it for verification, mostly as routine. Dana, once she found out, wasn't willing to wait on routine. She filed a record records request herself. What came back 6 days later was a copy of Roland's military discharge paperwork. He had served for 6 months. He was separated under conditions the paperwork listed in flat bureaucratic language as related to a pattern of insubordination, not injury, not combat, not the IED story he told my mother's grief group, and apparently half of Cedar Hollow for the past 3 years. His entire identity, the wounded warrior who understood loss, the man whose authority in our house rested partly on the idea that he'd sacrificed something enormous, was built on a story that wasn't true. I remember sitting on Dana's back porch reading that document, feeling something shift in my chest that wasn't quite triumph and wasn't quite grief, but sat somewhere close to both. Roland tried one more angle before the lawyers took over the story completely. My mother and Roland attended Cedar Hollow Community Church most Sundays, and the pastor, a soft-spoken man named Reverend Aldous Pratt, called Dana's house that same week and asked carefully whether I'd be willing to sit down with him and my mother for what he called reconciliation counseling. Dana let me decide. I agreed, mostly because I still, somewhere underneath everything, wanted an adult with no stake in the outcome to look at the situation clearly and tell me I wasn't the problem. We met in a small office behind the sanctuary, the 4 of us, me, Dana, my mother, and Reverend Pratt. Roland wasn't there, which I noted, and which turned out to matter. My mother spent most of the meeting describing me as increasingly difficult to reach, and surrounded by people encouraging her to see the worst in her own family, a phrase that sounded suspiciously like something Roland would say, delivered in my mother's voice. Reverend Pratt listened patiently, and then he asked her directly whether she was aware that I'd been moved to an unheated basement as punishment. My mother hesitated. It was temporary, she said. It wasn't meant to be cruel. Diane, he said, and his voice had an edge to it I hadn't expected from a man who spent his Sundays talking about grace. I've known your family a long time. I baptized this girl. I don't think you understand how that sentence sounds out loud. The meeting ended without reconciliation, but it did something I hadn't anticipated. It planted a seed of doubt in the one corner of my mother's life where Roland's version of events had gone completely unchallenged. Reverend Pratt called Dana privately 2 days later and told her, off the record, that he'd be willing to speak to anyone from the court if it came to that. It eventually did, and his testimony about that meeting became one of the smaller but steadier pieces of the case against how I'd been treated, a neutral witness with no reason to lie, describing my mother's own words back to a judge. Dana found us a lawyer that same week, a family law attorney named Priya Nair, who worked for a legal aid clinic in Columbus and agreed to take my case pro bono after hearing Dana lay out the basics over the phone. At 16, with documentation like this, Priya told me at our first meeting, flipping through the folder Dana had started, you have a real shot at protective custody arrangements and possibly at recovering some of what was taken from that insurance policy. But I need everything. Every text, every email, every document. Documentation is the only thing that matters in family court. Feelings don't win cases. Paper does. So I started building a file. Every threatening text Roland had sent, I saved and screenshotted with timestamps. Every message where he'd tried, over group texts with my mother's side of the family, to paint me as unstable or ungrateful, I saved. I asked my mother's sister, my Aunt Renata, whether Roland had ever messaged her directly, and she forwarded me 3 texts from him that read less like concern for a struggling teenager and more like a campaign to control the narrative before I could tell it myself. One of those texts, dated the week after I moved to Dana's, stood out enough that Priya flagged it immediately during our second meeting. Roland had written to Renata, unprompted, insisting that the financial side of things is completely under control and none of Sadie's business. A sentence he had no reason to bring up at all unless something about the financial side was already sitting uneasily with him. Priya circled it in red pen. Guilty people over-explain things nobody asked about, she told me. Innocent people don't usually feel the need to reassure anyone about money nobody's questioning yet. I also went back through 3 years of my own old phone, an ancient one Dana had kept charged in a drawer, and found a screenshot I'd taken at 14, mostly out of boredom, of a home screen widget showing our shared family calendar. On it, months before the coffee mug morning, was a calendar entry in my mother's handwriting style that just read our bank 10 a.m. Dated the same week, I would only later realize, as the home equity loan closing. At the time, I'd taken the screenshot because I liked the little weather icon next to it. I had no idea, sorting through it 2 years later on Dana's kitchen table, that I was holding a timestamp that would help corroborate exactly when the fraudulent notarization had to have happened. Priya built a timeline out of pieces like that. A calendar screenshot taken for no reason. A text about money nobody had asked about. A hotel key sleeve that had ended up in a donation box by accident. None of it on its own would have proven anything. Stacked together, dated and cross-referenced, it became the kind of case a judge couldn't wave away as a teenager's exaggeration. It was during this period, while helping Dana sort through a box of my father's old paperwork, looking for a copy of the original insurance policy, that I noticed something small and strange. The kind of detail you file away without understanding its weight yet. Tucked into an old coat of Roland's that had ended up, through some mix-up, in a donation box Dana was sorting through, was a hotel key card sleeve. Cypress Bay Inn, Gulfport, Mississippi. Dated 6 weeks earlier. Roland had told my mother that trip was a work conference for his employer, Vantage Supply Co., a regional industrial parts distributor he worked for as a sales manager. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just remember thinking it was strange that a man who complained constantly about tight finances had been flying to the Gulf Coast on what he called work. My mother tried one more time to pull me back before things escalated further. She showed up at Dana's house alone on a Sunday afternoon in early February and asked to speak with me on the porch, just the 2 of us. She looked smaller than I remembered her being. She sat on the porch step and tears streamed down her face, and she said she only wanted our family to feel normal again. For one single second, watching her cry in a way that looked almost like the mother I remembered remembered from before my father died, I almost believed her. Then she added, in the same breath, that if I kept causing problems with lawyers and caseworkers, I would destroy any chance we had left at being a family. That's when I finally understood, completely and without any remaining doubt, what that visit actually was. It was never an apology. It was a leash, dressed up in tears. I pulled my hand out of hers and told her I needed to go back inside. 2 weeks later, Roland made the mistake that turned out to matter most. He showed up unannounced at Cedar Hollow High School during fourth period and told the front office he needed access to my academic and counseling records because he was my legal guardian. He was not. He had never adopted me, and with an active custody petition filed, his access to anything involving me had already been formally restricted, a fact the front office staff, fortunately, had been notified of that same morning by Priya's office as a precaution. When they told him he'd need documentation, he raised his voice loud enough that the assistant principal called school security. He was walked out through the front doors while my sixth period class watched through the hallway windows, whispering, and I stood among them, feeling my face go hot, understanding that whatever privacy I'd had left in that town was now gone too. Priya filed for an emergency custody modification the following morning, citing the school incident along with everything else in the file. My mother received the paperwork by certified mail 2 days later and called me, screaming, saying I was destroying her entire life, that I had turned her own family against her, that she didn't recognize the daughter she'd raised. I let her finish. Then I said, "You didn't raise me to sleep in a basement, Mom. Roland did that, and you let him." She hung up on me. I didn't call back. The hearing was scheduled for a freezing morning in mid-March in Cedar County Family Court, a squat brick building with high ceilings and radiators that clanked every few minutes like they were trying to interrupt the proceedings. I sat at a table with Priya. My mother and Roland sat at another table, 20 feet away, close enough that I could see Roland's jaw working the same way it had the morning of the coffee mug. My mother's eyes wouldn't meet mine. I testified for 45 minutes. My voice shook through most of it, but it didn't break, and I finished every answer I started. I described the basement. I described the suitcase. I described the morning he'd screamed close enough that his spit landed on my face, and I watched Judge Miriam Whitfield's expression shift almost imperceptibly from professional neutrality into something sharper. Priya laid out the documentation methodically, the fake discharge story and the real discharge paperwork beside it, the deed transfer from October 2023, the missing insurance funds, the threatening texts, screenshot by screenshot, timestamp by timestamp, projected onto a screen at the front of the courtroom. Then Priya said she had one final piece of evidence, something Roland did not know we had, something that would prove exactly where every dollar of my college fund had actually gone. Judge Whitfield looked up slowly from her papers. "Present it," she said. Priya opened a second folder, thinner than the first, and my mother's face went completely white before a single word inside it was read out loud. What Priya's investigator had found, working off nothing more than a Gulfport Hotel key sleeve I'd mentioned almost as an afterthought during a prep meeting, was a property record. Priya later told me the investigator, a retired court clerk named Owen Bracey, who did this kind of work part-time for the legal aid clinic, had started with the hotel name alone, cross-referencing guest patterns against Roland's known travel dates from his own expense reports, which Priya had subpoenaed from Vantage Supply Cover weeks earlier. Once the dates lined up too neatly to be coincidence, Bracey pulled Mississippi property records for anyone connected to the address the hotel loyalty program had on file. That search turned up a Delaware LLC with an Ohio registered agent, which was the detail that made him sit up, he told Priya later, because nobody forms an out-of-state shell company for a beach vacation. In June 2023, that limited liability company, called Redwood Bay Holdings LLC, had been formed in Delaware. The registered agent used a P.O. box in Columbus, Ohio, a box Bracey traced to a UPS store less than a mile from Roland's office. The LLC's sole documented asset was a house on the water in Gulfport, Mississippi, purchased in August 2023 for $210,000. The down payment on that house, $85,000 of it, traced through a wire transfer dated 3 weeks after the purchase of the property, matched almost to the dollar the exact amount of my father's life insurance policy. The remainder had come from a home equity loan of $60,000 taken out against 14 Birchwood Lane in July 2023, using Roland's name on the joint deed, my mother's signature notarized alongside his, though Priya's investigator had flagged something odd about the notarization date that would matter later, and listed as co-owner of Redwood Bay Holdings LLC alongside Roland Ashford was a woman named Denise Farrow, 44 years old, of Gulfport, Mississippi. According to records Priya's investigator had pulled from public social media, Denise Farrow worked at a marina office 2 miles from the Cypress Bay Inn. She and Roland appeared, based on photographs going back to at least the spring of 2023, to be in a relationship that had nothing to do with any work conference. My mother made a sound in that courtroom I had never heard her make before, a short, strangled sound, half gasp, half something closer to a sob that she caught in her own throat before it could fully form. "I didn't know," she said, to no one, to everyone. "Roland, tell them I didn't know about this." Roland said nothing. His jaw worked side to side, the same tell from the coffee mug morning, except this time there was nowhere for him to direct it. He stared straight ahead at the judge's bench, and for the first time since I'd known him, I watched every ounce of certainty drain out of his face in real time. "Mr. Ashford," Judge Whitfield said, "would you like to explain to this court where your stepdaughter's college fund actually went?" He didn't answer. The silence stretched long enough that it became its own kind of answer. His attorney leaned over and whispered something to him, and Roland shook his head, once sharply, like a man refusing to be talked into admitting anything on the record. I watched him, instead, reach for the same tone he'd always used on me, the calm, reasonable, slightly disappointed voice that made every accusation sound like it was really about my behavior instead of his. "With respect, Your Honor," he finally said, "I think this family has been through through enough without turning a private financial arrangement into a spectacle. A spectacle, Judge Whitfield repeated, and something in her voice went very flat. Mr. Ashford, a 16-year-old testified this morning that you screamed at her closely enough for your saliva to land on her face over the tone of a greeting, in a house her deceased father built and paid for in full. I've now been shown documentation that the money left for her education was used in part to purchase real estate for what appears to be an undisclosed relationship. I don't think spectacle is the word you're looking for. The courtroom stayed silent after that in a way I felt in my chest. My mother turned to look at me then, fully, for the first time since we'd sat down. Her mouth opened like she wanted to say something, and I don't know what it would have been. An apology, or an accusation, or something in between, because Priya spoke before she could. Your Honor, we'd also like to enter into the record a discrepancy the investigator flagged regarding the notarization on the home equity loan documents. The notary's log shows Mrs. Ashford's signature was witnessed on July 14, 2023. Mrs. Ashford has confirmed in a sworn statement provided to us last week that she was in Cleveland visiting her sister on that date and did not sign any loan documents in person. The courtroom went very still. I want to be clear about what that means, Priya continued. Either the notarization is fraudulent, or Mrs. Ashford's signature was obtained under circumstances she did not fully understand. Either way, it raises serious questions about whether Mr. Ashford was operating entirely independently of his wife and siphoning funds out of that household, funds that included Sadie's inheritance. I watched my mother's face while Priya said this, and for the first time in 3.5 years, I saw something in it I couldn't call performance. She looked genuinely, completely blindsided. Not by the accusation of enabling my abuse, she'd known about that, she'd participated in that with open eyes, but by the specific betrayal of Denise Farrow and a beach house, and a secret second life financed partly with her own home equity, and partly with her dead first husband's life insurance policy for their daughter. Roland finally spoke, and it was not an apology. This is a private business matter, he said. It has nothing to do with custody. It has everything to do with custody, Judge Whitfield said, given that the business in question was funded by misappropriating a minor's inheritance and a fraudulent loan against her family home. Mr. Ashford, I'd advise you to consult an attorney of your own before you say anything further, because what you've just described sounds less like a business matter and less like a family matter, and considerably more like fraud. Roland's face had gone the color of the courtroom's gray walls. I stood up. I hadn't planned to. Priya put a hand lightly on my arm, a small caution, but I stayed standing anyway. Can I say something? I asked the judge. She nodded. I turned, not to the judge, but to Roland, and then to my mother. You told me I was worthless, I said to Roland. You told me nobody wanted me around. You said all of that in a house my father built with his own hands, using money you were stealing from me the entire time you were saying it. I want everyone in this room to understand that. Every time you screamed at me for being ungrateful, you already knew exactly where that money was. You knew, and you still stood in that kitchen and called me pathetic. Roland's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I turned to my mother. And you stood there and smiled, I said. You told me I should have learned to respect the man who stole Dad's house. You said that to me. Do you understand what that man actually did while you were defending him? My mother was crying now, openly, not the practiced tears from the porch in February, but something raw, something that looked like it was costing her. I need you to know I'm not the same person you raised me to pretend to be, I said, and my voice finally did the thing I'd been trying to prevent all morning. It cracked. I'm not going to apologize for existing in the house my father built. I'm not going to apologize for telling the truth. I needed you to be my mother, and instead you were his witness. That's what I'll remember. Not that you were cruel, that you watched and you smiled and you called it discipline. I sat back down. The courtroom was silent except for the radiator clanking somewhere behind the bench. Judge Whitfield granted the emergency custody modification that day, placing me in Aunt Dana's legal guardianship pending a full hearing scheduled for the following month, and referred the financial records to the county prosecutor's office for review of possible fraud charges related to both the insurance funds and the notarized loan documents. She also issued a formal restriction barring Roland from any contact with me outside of future court proceedings. Outside the courthouse, in the parking lot, my mother caught up to Dana and me before we reached the car. Roland was nowhere in sight. He'd left through a different exit. Already on his phone. Already, I would later learn, calling a divorce attorney. Sadie, my mother said, please, I need you to know I really didn't know about her. About Denise. I believe you, I said, and I did mostly. But you knew about the basement. You knew about the suitcase. You knew he screamed at me and called me pathetic in front of you. And you never once, in 3.5 years, took my side over his. Denise Farrow isn't the reason I don't trust you anymore, Mom. She's just the reason you finally understand what everyone else already knew. She didn't have an answer for that. I didn't wait for one. Dana drove me home, to her house, which had started somewhere in the last 2 months to feel more like home than 14 Birchwood Lane ever had again. The weeks that followed were not clean or simple, and anyone who tells you a story like this ends the moment a judge bangs a gavel is selling you something. The county prosecutor's office opened a formal investigation into Roland within days, focused on the wire transfer of the insurance funds and the notarized loan documents with the falsified witness date. Roland was charged that spring with 2 counts of financial exploitation of a minor and 1 count of forgery, related specifically to the notary discrepancy. He hired a defense attorney who tried predictably to argue that the insurance funds had been used for legitimate household expenses that indirectly benefited me, an argument that fell apart once Priya's team produced the wire transfer records showing the money moving in a single transaction, 3 weeks after the Gulfport property closing, directly into Redwood Bay Holdings LLC. My mother filed for divorce 11 days after the hearing. Whether that was genuine heartbreak over Denise Farrow or simple self-preservation once she understood how deep the legal exposure went, I honestly still don't know, and I've stopped stop needing to know. Both things can be true of the same decision. People are rarely only one thing. Family lines split in ways I hadn't fully predicted. My mother's sister, Renata, sided with me completely, and it was her forwarded texts from Roland that ended up strengthening the pattern of isolation portion of the custody case. My mother's mother, my grandmother Eleanor, took longer, calling me twice that spring to ask, in a tone that still carried some disbelief, whether I was exaggerating for the lawyers, a question that stung more than I expected it to, coming from her. I've known Roland for 4 years, she told me on the phone, the second time she called in May. He's always been perfectly polite to me. I just find it hard to picture him screaming at anyone. He wasn't screaming at you, Grandma, I said. That's the whole point. He was screaming at me. She was quiet for a long moment. Your mother says you've become very dramatic since the divorce started. I was quiet for 3.5 years, Grandma, I said. Dramatic would have been calling the police myself the first time he screamed at me. I didn't do that. Aunt Dana did, and only after he sent me to sleep on concrete in January. If that's dramatic, I don't know what word is left for what he actually did. I didn't argue with her that day. I just told her I loved her and hung up, and I sat with how strange it was that the people furthest from the daily reality of that house were the ones most confident they understood it. It took until early June, after I finally sent her the coffee mug morning text thread, word for word, timestamps and all, along with a screenshot of the message Roland had sent me the night I left, the one accusing me of bringing outsiders into a private family matter, before she called back. She didn't say much. She said, I read all of it. I'm sorry I made you convince me. And then she cried on the phone for a while, and for the first time in my life, my grandmother apologized to me for doubting a 16-year-old over a grown man's carefully maintained reputation. Marisol, my best friend since 4th grade, had drifted from me over the 2 years Roland worked to isolate me from her, and I hadn't realized how much I'd missed her until she showed up at Dana's house uninvited in late April, holding a grocery store cake and a card that just said, I should have pushed harder. I'm here now. We sat on Dana's back steps and she told me her mother had suspected something was wrong for over a year, ever since that gentle question at pickup that Roland had used as ammunition to keep me away from her. I thought you just didn't want to hang out anymore, Marisol said. I didn't know it wasn't your choice. We spent that whole afternoon rebuilding 2 years of missed conversations, one memory at a time, and by the time she left, it felt like something that had been broken for a long time had finally been set back on its hinges. Cedar Hollow is small enough that news like ours doesn't stay contained to a courtroom. By that summer, most of the town had some version of the story, filtered through whoever was telling it. Some of it was kind. A woman from my father's old electrical crew left a card in Dana's mailbox with $200 in it and a note that just said, Marcus would be proud of you. Some of it wasn't. A post appeared in a Cedar Hollow community group online, written by someone who clearly knew Roland socially, suggesting I'd torn a family apart over money. A comment that stayed up for 3 days before someone who actually knew the details of the fraud case replied to it with the docket number, and the post quietly disappeared. I learned that summer that you don't get to control the story once it leaves your hands, and that the best you can do is make sure the true version exists somewhere solid enough that it eventually wins out. Ours did mostly because we had paper. Paper always outlasted rumor. Even Mr. Petrosky, my old track coach, found me at a summer meet in Westerville that July, walked over during warm-ups, and apologized again, unprompted, for accepting my mother's rebellious phase explanation the year before. I should have asked you directly, he said. I'm going to remember that the next time a kid on my team goes quiet. I told him it wasn't his fault, and I meant it, but I also understood, standing there in the July heat, that this was going to keep happening for a while, adults circling back, one at a time, to reckon with what they'd missed. I decided I'd rather have that than silence. At least it meant people were finally willing to look. Mrs. Hensley kept checking in on me for the rest of the school year, quietly, without making a production of it. A note in the margin of an essay, an extra minute after class to ask how the custody hearing had gone. I don't think she'll ever know how much that steadiness meant. The fact that one adult in my life kept doing the small, unglamorous work of paying attention. Roland made one last desperate move that April, showing up at Dana's workplace, a dental office in Westerville, and waiting in the parking lot until she finished her shift, trying to convince her to talk some sense into me before the final custody hearing, framing himself as a man who'd made mistakes but didn't deserve to lose everything. Dana called the police from the parking lot while he was still standing there. The violation of the no-contact order added a 4th charge to the case against him, and effectively ended any leverage his attorney had been trying to build toward a plea deal favorable to him. There was a moment, sometime in late April, sitting in Dana's kitchen doing homework at a table that wasn't cracked and wasn't threatening to be cracked, when I let myself grieve the family I didn't get. Not Roland. I felt nothing for Roland by then except a kind of exhausted contempt. I grieved my mother, the version of her from before my father died, the one who sang off-key in the car and never once, not a single time in 11 years, made me apologize for a mess I hadn't finished cleaning. I grieved the fact that grief itself was what had made room for Roland to walk in and take everything, including her. I sat at that table and cried for probably 20 minutes, quietly, not because anything new had happened, but because I finally had a safe enough place to let it out. The house on Birchwood Lane sold that August, as part of the divorce settlement and the ongoing restitution proceedings tied to Roland's fraud case. Half of the equity from the sale, along with restitution the court ordered from Roland directly, was placed into a trust for my education, supervised by Dana as trustee until I turned 21. It wasn't the full $85,000 my father had originally left me. Legal fees and the slow grinding math of a fraud case ate into it, but it was close enough, and more importantly, it was mine again, with my name on the paperwork this time, not tucked inside an account I couldn't touch. Priya stayed involved longer than I think she was technically required to. She helped Dana set up the trust paperwork that fall, sitting at Dana's kitchen table for 2 hours on a Saturday, explaining, in plain language, storage, exactly what I could and couldn't access before I turned 21, and why the structure mattered. So nobody ever gets to do to you again what got done to you the first time, she said. And I understood she meant it both as legal advice and as something closer to a promise. She checked in every few months after the case formally closed, usually just a short email asking how school was going, and when I got my first college acceptance letter that winter from Ohio University's education program, she was one of the first people I told before I'd even told my mother. I thought about becoming a lawyer for a while, somewhere in the middle of all of it, the way you sometimes want to become whoever saved you. I've settled, at least for now, on wanting to teach, something closer to what Mrs. Hensley did for me, the quiet, unglamorous work of noticing a kid who's struggling and refusing to look away from it. I don't know yet if that's the right path. I know it's the one that makes sense out of everything I went through, which feels like enough of a reason for now. I didn't go to the closing. I couldn't watch strangers walk through the rooms my father built, put their own furniture where ours used to be. Dana went in my place, and afterward she drove out to the empty lot on Route 9, where my father's old garage workshop still stood. The town had never redeveloped that stretch of road, and we sat on the tailgate of her truck, and I told her, for the first time out loud, that I missed him. Not Roland, not even my mother, not exactly, just him, just my dad, and the version of a life we would have had if a cell in his pancreas had never gone wrong. The financial side of the case dragged on far longer than the criminal one, in the tedious, grinding way these things apparently always do. Priya explained early on that restitution and criminal punishment run on separate tracks, and that getting money back is almost always slower and less certain than getting a conviction. Redwood Bay Holdings LLC was dissolved by court order that summer, and the Gulfport property was placed under a lien pending the outcome of both the criminal case and a separate civil claim Priya filed on my behalf to recover the misappropriated insurance funds directly. Vantage Supply Calmer, Roland's employer, quietly let him go in June, once local news picked up the story of his arraignment, which meant he no longer had steady income to draw restitution payments from, which meant the trust that was eventually funded for me depended almost entirely on the sale of the Gulfport house, and whatever equity remained in Birchwood Lane after the divorce settlement, a fact that turned what should have been a straightforward repayment into 18 more months of filings, continuances, and phone calls with Priya's office that always started with her saying, gently, I don't have great news, but I don't have bad news either, just slow news. Roland pled guilty that October to financial exploitation and forgery in exchange for the isolation-related charges being dropped, and was sentenced to 18 months, with restitution obligations that would follow him for years afterward, regardless of whether he ever served a full day of the sentence connected to them. My mother testified against him in the sentencing phase, which surprised me less than it probably should have. She stood at a podium in the same courtroom where I'd testified in March, and in a voice much steadier than the one she'd used on Dana's porch, she told the judge that whatever her own failures had been as a mother during that marriage, Roland had built a second life on money that was never his to touch, and that she wanted the court to know she supported the restitution order in full, including the portion that would come out of what remained of her own share of the house sale. I wasn't in the courtroom for the sentencing. I testified once in March, and Priya told me I didn't need to be present for the rest, that my part of the case was essentially finished. I read about it afterward. In a summary Priya emailed me, sitting at Dana's kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon, and I remember feeling less satisfaction than I expected to. Mostly I just felt tired, in the specific way you feel tired after carrying something heavy for a very long distance and finally getting to set it down. Denise Farrow, according to Renata, who still tracked these things more than I did, sold the Gulfport house within months of the lien being lifted, and, as far as anyone knew, wanted nothing further to do with any of it. She was never charged with anything. Priya explained that the evidence didn't support the idea that she'd known where the down payment money actually came from, and I found, to my own mild surprise, that I didn't have much anger left over for her by the time all of it settled. She was just another person Roland had lied to, in a different way than he'd lied to us, and I couldn't work up the energy to hate a stranger for a man's dishonesty that had nothing to do with her knowing the truth. It's been a year since the hearing where Priya opened that second folder. I'm 17 now. I live with Dana full-time, in a 2-bedroom house in Westerville with a room that's actually mine. No basement, no thermostat I don't control, no suitcase waiting by the door as a threat disguised as an option. I run varsity cross-country in the fall, the same sport I ran quietly and alone during the worst of it, back when nobody came to watch. Dana comes to every meet. She has a folding chair with her name written on the back in permanent marker, and she brings it every single time, rain or not. My mother and I talk sometimes, carefully, the way you talk to someone you're still deciding whether to trust again. She's in therapy now, which I'm glad about, for her sake, and, selfishly, for the sake of whatever relationship we might eventually rebuild. We're not there yet. Some days I think we might get there. Some days I think what broke in that kitchen over a spilled glass of orange juice, 3 years before anyone screamed about coffee, broke in a way that doesn't fully mend, no matter how much later understanding gets layered on top of it. There's a version of this story where I tell you I've forgiven everyone completely and everything is fine now, and the scar tissue doesn't ache when the weather changes. That version would be easier to end on, and it wouldn't be true. I still flinch sometimes at raised voices that have nothing to do with me. A teacher speaking sharply to another student, a stranger arguing on the phone in a parking lot. Dana noticed it before I did, and gently, without making it a bigger conversation than it needed to be, found me a counselor in Westerville I still see every other week. I'm not broken, I want to be clear about that, but I'm not pretending 3.5 years in that house left nothing behind either. Healing, I've learned, isn't the absence of a mark. It's learning to carry the mark without it running the rest of your life. I think about that morning a lot. The coffee mug cracking the tile, the spit on my cheek, my mother's hand on his shoulder instead of mine. I used to think the worst part was the cruelty. I don't think that anymore. The worst part was the smile. Cruelty Cruelty, at least, is honest about what it is. A smile worn over cruelty is a choice to make the cruelty look like love. And it took me most of a year in a courtroom, sorting through wire transfers and a discharge record and a hotel key sleeve from Mississippi, to understand that the smile was the actual betrayal, not the basement, not even the stolen money, the smile. He didn't steal my father's house because he was powerful. He stole it because my mother let him. One small, silent moment at a time, until silence became a habit neither of them could break, even once it started costing them everything. That's the part I hope anyone listening to this actually takes with them. It's rarely one dramatic theft. It's 100 small permissions granted quietly by someone who was supposed to protect you instead. I still have the house key from Birchwood Lane. I don't know why I kept it. It doesn't open anything anymore. New owners changed the locks the week they moved in, the way you're supposed to. I keep it in the drawer of my nightstand anyway, next to a photograph of my dad standing in the framed-out shell of what would become my bedroom. Chalk lines snapped across plywood, pointing at the exact spot where he told me my bed would go. Some nights I take it out and just hold it, not because I want that house back. I don't. I want the version of my life where it never had to become a crime scene of paperwork and betrayal in the first place. I don't get that version. Nobody ever does. What I got instead was proof. Real, dated, undeniable proof that I wasn't the pathetic, ungrateful thing he screamed at me across that kitchen. I was just the only one in that house still telling the truth. That's worth more than the house ever was.